Hello, I'm Chris Hartwell, and welcome to the Heartbeat. Today we're going to be talking about episode 6 of season 1 of HBO's Westworld. Join me, will you? Now, it may come as a bit of a surprise that this is my favorite episode of Westworld thus far, as it probably, of all of them, developed and explored the show's mysteries the least. But actually, it was because that aspect of the show was played more lightly that we were afforded a much stronger focus on the show's characters, both as individuals as well as their shared desires and struggles. And one of those shared struggles, and really the strongest element of the episode for me, was just that universal recognition that parents are in fact as flawed, fallible, and finite as we are. And that recognition was so beautifully connected to the show's black and white motif as well, playing perfectly into Maeve's maturation. So in contrast to the once naive, dressed in white Dolores, Maeve woke up dressed in black. The character was growing wiser and wiser by the day and was now prepared to do nearly anything to continue down that path of discovery, even intentionally get herself killed. Which, of course, did remind me of Groundhog Day and Edge of Tomorrow, where each death only made the deceased that much more capable in their return. And though the episode closed with Maeve using her new knowledge to manipulate Felix and Sylvester into decreasing her pain and increasing her intelligence, for me the real emotional climax of the episode, and probably one of, if not the best moments of the series thus far, was when Maeve took that walk of discovery, finally beholding in full her parents' dispassionate creation of her brothers and sisters. And with Ramin Djawadi's score really doing a lot of the legwork, that scene just so perfectly sucked me in to that character's point of view. I felt, along with her, what it meant to be a child. At long last forced to acknowledge that the level of trust once had in authority, even if for her was just something that was implanted into her synthetic subconscious, was to a certain extent misplaced. And the way that scene ultimately built to her seeing her own history used flippantly as this ridiculous marketing tool was just powerfully moving. Another moment that was just outstanding, which occurred right before that one, was when Maeve discovered just how mapped and controlled her mind really was, literally getting to see her words predicted before she even said them. It's interesting to note, too, that before that truth overloaded her circuits, she was trying to improvise, trying to break free, and now with her upgrades, I'm certain that she will become more and more successful at handling that truth, which will ultimately lead to her freedom. And of course, it was quite rewarding that this show finally had a character ask the question that this entire series really is tailor-made to ask. That being when Maeve asked Felix, "How do you know that you're different? That you're human? We feel the same." Which I will actually now use to segue into Teddy and the Man in Black's storyline, because even though theirs was one of the few that didn't actually have the child-parent theme infused into it, it did, in a really artful and subtle way, perfectly connect to Maeve's storyline, specifically her numerous deaths and resurrections, as well as her search to understand how she was actually different to a human. And the image that so perfectly captured all of that was the field that Teddy and the Man in Black rode through, filled with the crossed-marked graves, each sporting a small bell. And for those of you that don't know, this was actually a common practice back in the 1800s, when medicine obviously wasn't quite as advanced as it is now, and roughly 2% of those thought dead and consequently buried weren't. And so gravediggers would affix a string to one of the corpse's fingers and attach on the other end that bell. That way, if they were alive, someone would hear about it. And obviously right there we have a very clear connection to the seeming deaths that Maeve had to endure, each of which led to a bell ringing of sorts as she rose again in Felix's laboratory. And that idea of death and resurrection was only further explored when Teddy described the maze itself as the sum of a man's life, the choices he makes, and there at the center is a legendary man, killed over and over, countless times, but always clawed his way back to life. What was really fantastic, though, was the additional level on which those bells played thematically, because the term ascribed to them, dead ringer, also means a person or thing that seems exactly like someone or something else, which, as we've already discussed, was precisely what Maeve perceived about herself and her human creators. And while on the subject of Teddy, it is fun to hypothesize just how similar he and Maeve's desires may actually have been. Even while Teddy himself spelt his out as, "I'm making peace with past indiscretions," and peace seemed to be the furthest thing away from Maeve's mind, it's important to remember that both characters had been influenced by an outside force, and I continue to contend that the outside force that influenced Teddy, that being Ford, planted those peace-seeking desires into him so that he could ultimately leave all this behind and finally break free, which was the very thing that Maeve seemed to have been pushed towards as well. It's also worth pointing out, even if it wasn't as simple as black means bad and white means good, it was still very appropriate that Teddy continued to quite literally change his hats this week, as he really went to a whole different place in slaughtering all of those soldiers. To return to those behind the scenes though, even as they started out with a lot more answers than Maeve, both Felix and Sylvester continued to learn that the authority figure in their life was making, at the very least, unannounced and at the very most unauthorized changes and alterations to the hosts' personalities. And though we know that some of those attributes were changed by Elsie back in episode 2, specifically Maeve's perception and emotional equity, the higher authority that raised her paranoia and self-preservation remains a mystery, an authority that Elsie seemed to get that much closer to this week. Unfortunately for her, as soon as she chose to enter that broadcasting old church alone, I knew that that authority would come crashing down upon her, demonstrating that it really wasn't cool to sneak into Dad's office, so to speak, when he wasn't home. And another relationship in which a character had to finally admit that the parental figure in his life may not actually be as omniscient or omnipotent as he once wanted to believe that they were was Bernard and Ford's, which was made all the more tragic when Bernard beheld young Ford, sorely reminded yet again of the other fractured parent-to-child relationship in his life. And I'm sure also that the relationship between Bernard and Ford is certainly in for a lot more tragedy as it's slowly eaten away by distrust and fear, which, as we learned this week, are two feelings that have been a part of Ford's existence for a long time. And similar to the moment of Maeve walking through those backstage floors, I absolutely loved what the writers were doing visually and thematically with Ford's hidden cottage. Because like Arnold explained long ago, the great artists always built themselves into their work. And so it was very unfortunately evident that Ford had, at too young of an age, discovered just how fallible his father really was, as seen not only in his drinking and volatile behavior, but also more subtly in Ford's voice command to his young self: turn the other cheek. This was a man who had likely been abused from a very young age, and had, from those days until now, been seeking to return to a simpler time and more peaceful place. A desire evident even in how he spoke of his new creations as compared to his old. What our new designs gained in efficiency, they lost in grace. And to make things even worse for him, not only did we learn that the board was actively seeking to find a new replacement, sending more people to oversee and assess, but Arnold continued to interfere, his grasp literally extending all the way into the most personal recesses of Ford's past, meddling with, as Ford described them, ghosts, survivors of the wreck of time. Ironically, even as young Ford said of the Greyhound that he killed, if it was dead, it couldn't hurt anything anymore. Arnold continued to hurt well after his own death. I remain curious how involved Ford was in the creation of the maze, and if he finds it surprising at all that that symbol continues to crop up everywhere. Though, considering that we discovered this week that Dolores was in fact one of Arnold's creations, and that her drawing was in that book, I'm assuming that that volume belonged to Arnold, not to Ford. So, all in all, I really did like this episode quite a lot, and I'm now all the more excited to return to Dolores, William, and Logan next week with the hopes that those characters will also get the same sort of treatment. Those are my thoughts anyways on this week's episode of Westworld. I would still love to know what you guys thought of the episode though, so definitely comment below and let me know. And before I close things out, I must give a very special shout out and thank you to Delonzo over on patreon.com, my newest patron over there. Delonzo, you the man. Thank you so much for pledging your hard-earned dollars to this channel, and just welcome to the Heartbeat team. And finally, to the rest of you, please do subscribe. I'm going to continue to review films and television on this channel, and I would love for you to stay up to date on all of those things. But for now, I'm Chris Hartwell. This is the Heartbeat. Thank you for joining me.